The Queen made her decision in the span of a single heartbeat, though the consequences would echo through the galaxy for millennia to come. You will be returned to your people, she announced, and her voice carried across the arena with the weight of absolute authority. Humanity is not suitable for the Crucible. A wave of clicking sounds rippled through the assembled soldiers. 10,000 warriors expressing their disbelief at what they had just heard in 3,000 years of the Crucible. No species had ever been deemed unsuitable. The test always ended the same way, with the tested species either accepted as servants or marked for destruction. And there had never been a third option until now. Marcus blinked through the blood in his remaining good eye, not quite believing what he had heard. "That is it?" he asked, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "I win one fight and you leave us alone." "You misunderstand, human," the Queen replied, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like respect. "This was not a test of your strength. It was a test of your nature." She gestured with one of her many arms, taking in the arena, the blood-soaked floor, the defeated Krethnul still kneeling where Marcus had left it. "We have conquered species far stronger than yours," she continued. "Species with natural weapons that could tear through our armor like it was paper. Species with abilities that seemed like magic to our ancestors." She paused, her compound eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "But they fought to survive," she said. "They fought because they had to, because their instincts demanded it." The Queen took a step closer, and Marcus had to fight the urge to back away. "You fought because you wanted to," she said. "Because something in your blood sings when you are pushed to the edge. Because there is a part of you that enjoys the struggle, no matter how hopeless it seems." Marcus thought about denying it, about claiming he had only fought because he had no other choice. But he knew it would be a lie. There had been moments during the fight, moments when his body was screaming for him to stop and his mind was telling him he was going to die. When he had felt something else entirely, he had felt alive, more alive than he had ever felt before. More present and focused and real than any other moment in his entire existence. And yes, some part of him had enjoyed it. "You are not warriors, human," the Queen said. "You are something far worse." She turned away from him and began walking back toward her throne, her soldiers parting before her in silence. "You are survivors," she said over her shoulder. "Creatures who will not stop fighting no matter what the odds, who will keep struggling and adapting and finding new ways to win long after any sensible species would have accepted defeat." She reached the base of her throne and turned to face the arena one last time. "Your ship will be repaired and your wounds will be treated," she announced. "You will carry a message back to your leaders." Marcus straightened his spine, ignoring the screaming protest of his broken ribs. "What message?" he asked. "The Vethkai Empire has no interest in human space," the Queen said, and each word seemed to cost her something. "We will establish a border between our territories, and that border will be permanent." She ascended her throne and settled back onto the seat of bones, looking down at the human who had changed everything. "Go home, Marcus Cole," she said. "Tell your people that the Vethkai will not come. And pray to whatever gods your kind worship that you never give us reason to reconsider." 3 months later, Marcus stood before the United Nations Security Council in a room that suddenly felt far too small for the weight of what he had to say. Scars from the arena were still visible on his face and arms, pale lines against his brown skin that would never fully fade. And every diplomat in the room was staring at them with a mixture of horror and fascination. He had spent 2 weeks in the aliens' medical bay after the fight, being healed by technology that seemed like magic, and another 2 months traveling back to Earth at speeds that should have been impossible. The Vethkai had kept their word, repairing his ship and programming the navigation computer with a root home, and they had not harmed him or threatened him or done Anything except treat him with a kind of wary respect that made him more nervous than their earlier contempt. Now he was home. And everyone wanted to know what had happened. "What did you do?" the Secretary General asked, leaning forward in her chair with an intensity that reminded Marcus of the alien queen. What could one man possibly do to turn back an empire? Marcus thought about the arena, about the blood and the pain and the silence of 10,000 soldiers, watching him refuse to die. He thought about the Crethanol kneeling before him, about the queen descending from her throne, about the look in her compound eyes when she finally understood what she was dealing with. "I showed them what we are," he said simply, "and they decided they did not want to find out what we could become." The room was silent. Every diplomat and general and president processing what those words meant. "They are still out there," the Secretary General said quietly. "Watching us." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "And they will keep watching for a very long time, waiting to see if we become the threat they fear or something they can eventually defeat." He looked around the room at the faces of humanity's leaders, at the people who would decide what to do with this information. "We need to be ready," he said. "We need to grow and learn and become stronger. Because one day, they might decide that the risk is worth it, that the cost of letting us continue is greater than the cost of wiping us out." He paused, remembering the arena, remembering the feel of his fists connecting with alien flesh. But until that day comes, they will not touch us, because they have seen what one human can do when pushed to the limit. He smiled, and there was something fierce in that smile, something that the aliens would have recognized, and they are terrified of finding out what 10 billion of us could do. Outside the windows of the conference room, the sun was setting over a world that would never know how close it had come to destruction. 8 billion people going about their lives, unaware that their entire future had been decided in an arena on the other side of the galaxy, by one man who had simply refused to give up somewhere out there, in the darkness between the stars. The Vethkai were watching and waiting and remembering the lesson that one bloody, broken human had taught them about the price of underestimating the survivors of a harsh and unforgiving world. It was a lesson they would not soon forget. Queen Sithavala had ruled the Vethkai Empire for 600 years, longer than most species had existed. And in all that time she had never known doubt. She had conquered worlds without number, had crushed rebellions before they could begin, had bent entire civilizations to her will through nothing more than the promise of destruction. Her empire stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy, and everywhere her ships traveled, they brought order and control and the absolute certainty that the Vethkai were superior to all other forms of life. But now, sitting on her throne of conquered bones and watching the human bleed on her arena floor, she felt something she had not felt since she was a youngling learning to hunt in the swamps of her homeworld. She felt afraid. It was not a fear of the human himself, though part of her recognized that even now, even broken and dying, he was dangerous in a way that most creatures could never abate. Was a fear of what he represented, a fear of what his species might become if given time to grow and spread and learn her. Advisors had briefed her on humanity before this test began, showing her everything the Empire Scouts had learned about this young race. They were primitive by Vethkai standards, barely capable of traveling between the worlds of their own small star system, with weapons that would be laughable against the Empire's warships and technology that was centuries behind the most basic Vethkai equipment. By every measure the Empire used to assess threats, humans were insignificant, a minor species that could be conquered or destroyed at any time with minimal effort. But those measures had never accounted for something like this. The Queen rose from her throne and began to descend the terraced walls of the arena, her soldiers parting before her like water around a stone. She moved slowly, deliberately, giving herself time to think as she approached the human who had just done the impossible. 10 billion, she thought, remembering what her scouts had reported. 10 billion humans, spread across their homeworld and their small collection of colonies. And if even a fraction of them could fight like this one, then the cost of conquering them would be beyond anything the Empire had ever paid before. Was not just the fighting ability that troubled her. Though that was impressive enough, it was the way the human had fought. The mindset behind each blow. The Krethnal had been bred for violence, created through careful genetic manipulation to be the perfect warrior. And it had fought the way such creatures always fought, with overwhelming force and absolute confidence in its own superiority. The human had fought differently. He had adapted, changed his tactics on the fly, used his smaller size and greater flexibility to find weaknesses in an opponent that should have killed him in the first second. More than that, he had endured wounds that would have killed most creatures, had pushed through pain that should have been unbearable, and he had done it all without the genetic modifications or combat drugs that other species used to achieve similar results. He had done it through nothing but willpower. The queen reached the arena floor and walked across the blood-stained crystal until she stood before the human, close enough to see the broken blood vessels in his remaining good eye, close enough to hear the wet rattle in his chest that told her his lungs were filling with fluid. He should have been dead by now. She knew, and yet somehow he remained standing. "How many of your kind exist?" she asked through her translator drone. Though she already knew the answer, 8 billion on Earth alone, the human replied, his voice steady despite his injuries. "And another 2 billion across the colonies." The queen's compound eyes flickered as she processed this information, running calculations in her mind that she did not want to complete 10 billion humans, each one potentially capable of what this one had done, each one carrying that same stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even with the Empire's superior technology, even with their vast fleets and endless soldiers. A war against such a species would be catastrophic. The Vethkai would win eventually, of that she had no doubt. But the cost would be beyond imagining. Entire fleets destroyed by humans who refused to surrender even when their ships were burning around them, armies ground down by soldiers who kept fighting even after they should have died, planets that could never be truly pacified because the humans living on them would never stop resisting no matter how many of them were killed. She had seen it before with other species, that kind of mindless resistance, but it had always burned itself out eventually. Looking into the human's eyes, she was not sure it would burn out this time. "You are a primitive species," she said slowly, "with crude technology and limited resources." "Yes," the human agreed, and there was no shame in his voice. "And yet you stand before me having defeated a creature bred specifically to kill." "Yes." The queen studied him for a long moment, trying to understand what she was seeing. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did you not give up when the fight was clearly lost?" The human seemed to consider the question, blood dripping from his wounds onto the crystal floor. "Because giving up was not an option," he said at last. "Because my people were counting on me, and because I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees." The queen understood then, in a way she had not before, what made humans dangerous. They were not strong like the Krethnal, not fast like the Vethkai, not cunning like the Mrither, or resilient like the Golgothi, were something worse. They were survivors, creatures forged in the fires of a harsh and unforgiving world, where only those who refused to give up could pass their traits to the next generation. They had no natural weapons, so they had learned to make their own. They had no natural armor, so they had learned to endure. They had no natural advantages at all, so they had learned to adapt and overcome and keep fighting long after any sensible creature would have accepted death. And that, the queen realized with growing horror, made them the most dangerous species she had ever encountered, because you could defeat such a species in battle. could burn their cities and destroy their fleets and kill them by the millions, but you could never truly conquer them. They would always keep fighting, always keep resisting, always keep looking for a way to turn the tables on their oppressors, and eventually, given enough time, they would find one. 17 minutes had passed since the fight began. Marcus knew this because he had been counting in his head. A trick his old boxing coach had taught him to stay focused during long fights. And now each number felt like a small victory against the darkness that kept trying to swallow him. The Crethanol was on its knees before him, one arm hanging useless at its side, its scaled hide torn open in a dozen places. Violet blood pooling beneath it like a shadow. Marcus stood over the creature, swaying like a tree in a storm. Barely able to keep his feet beneath him, his left eye was swollen, completely shut, and he could feel that at least 3 of his ribs were broken. And there was so much blood covering his body that he could not tell anymore which wounds were still bleeding and which had finally stopped. Every breath was agony, and every heartbeat sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was telling him that he had lost too much blood, that his body was shutting down, that he should have died 15 minutes ago. But he was still standing. The arena was silent in a way that felt almost sacred. 10,000 alien soldiers watching without making a sound, their all-black eyes reflecting the bloody scene below like dark mirrors. Marcus looked down at the creature that had been trying to kill him, at the warrior that had been bred for 10,000 generations to be the perfect killing machine. And he saw something in its eyes that he recognized. It was the look of a fighter who knew they were beaten. "Yield," Marcus said, and his voice came out as a rough whisper, barely loud enough to hear. "I do not want to kill you." The Crethanol looked up at him, and there was confusion on its terrible face. Confusion and something else. Something that might have been wondering, all its years of fighting, in all the hundreds of battles it had won, no one had ever offered it mercy. The creatures it fought always begged for their lives when they knew they were going to lose, screaming and crying and promising anything if the Crethanol would just let them live. But this human was different. This human had beaten it fairly, had taken everything the Crethanol could give and answered with violence of its own. And now, instead of finishing the kill, it was offering something the creature had never received. Before respect, the Crethanol lowered its head slowly, pressing its forehead against the blood-soaked floor, and the gesture was unmistakable, even to someone who had never seen the creature before. It was submitting. A sound went through the watching soldiers like a wave. Thousands of clicks and chirps that expressed an emotion their species had rarely felt. Before shock, the Crethanol had never lost a fight, not once in its entire existence. And now it was kneeling before a creature half its size with no weapons and no armor and no natural defenses at all. Marcus did not celebrate, did not raise his arms in victory, or cry out in triumph. He simply turned away from the defeated warrior and faced the throne, where Queen Sithavala sat watching every step he took, left a bloody footprint on the crystal floor, and his legs trembled with exhaustion, threatening to give out at any moment. But he kept walking until he stood at the edge of the arena, close enough to see his own reflection in the queen's compound eyes, close enough to see the way her many arms gripped the bones of her throne. "Well," he called out, and his voice echoed across the silent arena, stronger than it had any right to be. "Is that enough for you?" The queen did not answer immediately, and Marcus could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical thing pressing down on him. "Or do you have another one for me?" he continued, and there was something in his voice that might have been a challenge. "Because I can keep going if you want." It was a lie, of course, and they both knew it. Marcus was dying on his feet, running on nothing but willpower and stubbornness. And if they put another fighter in front of him, he would collapse before he could throw a single punch. But he said it anyway, because that was what humans did. They bluff. They stood tall even when they were broken, spoke with confidence even when they were terrified, and they never ever let their enemies see them give up. Queen Sithavala studied the human for a long moment, taking in the wounds that covered his body, the blood that dripped from his fingertips, the way his legs shook with the effort of staying upright. And then she looked at her soldiers, at the 10,000 warriors who surrounded the arena, the finest fighting force in 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. None of them had moved during the entire fight. None of them had cheered or jeered or made any sound at all. They had simply watched, paralyzed by something the Queen was only now beginning to understand. They were afraid not of this single human, not really, but of what he represented. They were afraid because they had just watched something impossible happen. And if one impossible thing could happen, then perhaps other impossible things could happen too. Perhaps the empire they had, built over 3,000 years, was not as unshakable as they had always believed. Perhaps there were things in the universe that could not be conquered. The Queen looked back at the human standing before her, bloody and broken, but still defiant, still dangerous, still refusing to fall. She made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. "Enough," she said, and her voice carried across the arena like a pronouncement from a god. "We have seen enough." The Crethanol was fast, faster than anything that size had any right to be, and its first swipe came at Marcus like a freight train made of razor blades. But Marcus had been watching, and he had seen the way the creature moved, the way it shifted its weight before it struck. And in the fraction of a second before those claws reached him, he was already moving, dropping low and rolling to the side as the attack passed through the space where his head had been. The creature roared in surprise, and Marcus used that moment to scramble back to his feet, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The Vethkai audience made a sound like wind through dry leaves, thousands of them clicking and chittering to each other, and Marcus did not need a translator to know they were surprised. Good, he thought. Let them be surprised. The Crethanol turned and came at him again, both arms sweeping in from different angles. And this time there was no room to dodge completely, and Marcus felt fire explode across his left shoulder as one of those terrible claws raked through his skin. Blood sprayed across the crystal floor, bright red against the pale surface, and the pain was so intense that for a moment Marcus could not think at all. But his body kept moving, kept fighting, because that was what it had been trained to do. And even as the blood poured down his arm, he stepped inside the creature's reach and drove his elbow up into the soft flesh under its jaw. Impact traveled up his arm and into his shoulder, and the Crethanol's head snapped back with a crack that echoed through the silent arena. It stumbled, just for a moment, and its oil-black eyes went wide with something that might have been shock. No one had ever hit it before, Marcus realized. Not like that, not hard enough to hurt. The creature recovered quickly, snarling and snapping its jaws, and it came at Marcus with renewed fury, its claws slashing through the air in patterns that seemed almost random. And Marcus danced backward, ducking and weaving, taking small cuts on his arms and chest as he searched for another opening. He found one when the Crethanol overextended on a thrust aimed at his throat, and Marcus grabbed the creature's wrist with both hands and used its own momentum to pull it off balance, driving his knee up into its midsection. With every ounce of strength he had, the creature made a sound like a deflating balloon and doubled over. And Marcus did not hesitate, bringing both fists down on the back of its skull like a hammer. The Crethanol went down to one knee, and the arena erupted in clicking sounds that might have been gasps of disbelief up on her throne. Queen Sithavala leaned forward, her compound eyes fixed on the small human who was somehow still alive. Marcus did not give the creature time to recover, stepping in and driving a knee into its face, feeling something crack under the impact, and the Crethanol roared in pain and lashed out blindly, one claw catching Marcus across the ribs and opening a gash that went down to the bone. The world went white with pain, and Marcus staggered backward, his hand pressed against the wound, blood pouring between his fingers. He should have fallen, should have collapsed and died right there on the crystal floor. But something inside him refused to let that happen. He thought about his mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, who had never complained even when her hands bled from scrubbing other people's floors. He thought about his father, who had died in a factory accident when Marcus was 12, who had spent his last breath telling Marcus to be strong. He thought about all the people who had ever told him he was not good enough, not smart enough, not tough enough to make something of himself, and he straightened his spine and raised his fists and kept fighting. The Crethnal was bleeding now too, violet blood mixing with red on the arena floor, and there was confusion in its eyes. Confusion and something that might have been the beginning of fear. It had never faced anything like this. Marcus understood, had never fought something that refused to stay down no matter how badly it was hurt. The creature came at him again, more cautious this time, and Marcus met it head-on, trading blows that would have killed a normal man 10 times over, taking wounds that should have been fatal and answering each one with strikes of his own. He broke 2 of the creature's fingers when it tried to grab him. Hearing the bone snap under his hands, he drove his thumb into its eye socket when it got too close. Feeling the soft tissue give way beneath the pressure, he headbutted it when it tried to bite him, cracking his forehead against the ridge of its nose and seeing stars explode across his vision. Blood was everywhere now, his and the creature's, painting the crystal floor in patterns of red and violet. And still the fight continued. 2 beings locked in a dance of violence that neither seemed willing to end. The HFY soldiers watched in absolute silence, not moving, barely breathing, their eyes fixed on the impossible scene playing out before them. They had seen the Crethnal fight before, had watched it tear through armored warriors like they were made of paper, and now this small soft creature with no claws and no fangs and no armor was standing toe-to-toe with it and refusing to die. Queen Sithivolis' hands gripped the arms of her throne so tightly that the bone creaked under the pressure. She had ruled the HFY for 600 years, had conquered more worlds than she could count, had seen every kind of warrior the galaxy had to offer. But she had never seen anything like this. The human was clearly dying, losing blood faster than his body could replace it, his movements growing slower and more desperate with each passing moment. But there was something in his eyes, something fierce and bright and utterly unbreakable. And for the first time in centuries, the queen felt something cold stir in her chest. She was beginning to understand that she had made a terrible mistake. Commander Marcus Cole had been a prisoner on the alien ship for 11 days when they finally came for him. The cell was small and dark and smelled like chemicals he could not name. And every day the insect creatures would come and scan him with their machines and take samples of his blood and whisper to each other in clicking sounds that made his skin crawl. He did not know what they wanted from him, but he knew it was nothing good. The creatures called themselves the HFY, and they were unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with bodies covered in hard black shells like beetles, with too many arms and eyes that looked like pools of oil. And when they moved, it was with a terrible grace that reminded Marcus of spiders hunting in the dark. They had taken him from his patrol ship 3 weeks ago, killing his entire crew in the process, and he had watched helplessly as they tore through the hull like it was made of paper. And he had seen good men and women die screaming in the cold vacuum of space. He was the only survivor, and he did not know why they had kept him alive on the 11th day. The door to his cell opened and 4 HFY soldiers entered, their black armor gleaming in the dim light. And they grabbed him with their too many hands and dragged him through corridors that twisted and turned like the inside of some great beast. The ship was massive, larger than anything humans had ever built, and everywhere Marcus looked, he saw more of the creatures. Thousands of them going about their business without even glancing at the small human. Being dragged through their midst, they did not see him as a threat. He realized, and that made him angry in a way he could not fully explain. They brought him to a chamber that took his breath away. A vast arena, carved from some kind of crystal that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 colors, with terraced walls that rose up and up until they disappeared into darkness. And every level was filled with HFY soldiers watching him with their oil-black eyes. At the very top sat a throne made of bones. And on that throne sat the largest HFY Marcus had ever seen. She was different from the others. Her shell a deep purple instead of black, her body longer and more elegant, with a crown of spines rising from her head like some terrible flower. And when she looked at Marcus, he felt like an insect under a magnifying glass. "I am Queen Sithavala," she said through a small floating machine that translated her clicking speech into words Marcus could understand. "And you are the first human we have captured alive." Marcus stood as straight as he could, with his hand bound behind his back, refusing to show fear even though his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. The queen made a sound that might have been laughter, a dry clicking noise that echoed through the arena. "Your species is new to us," she said, "and we must determine your worth before we decide what to do with your world." She gestured with one of her many arms, and the floating translator continued to speak. "For 3,000 years, the HFY have ruled this part of the galaxy, and every species we encounter must pass through the crucible, a test of combat that shows us what a race is truly made of." Marcus felt cold spread through his chest as he began to understand. "If you fight well, your species will be given the honor of serving the Empire," the queen continued. "And if you fight poorly, we will travel to your homeworld and burn it to ash." "And if I win?" Marcus asked. The arena fell silent, and for a long moment the queen simply stared at him with those terrible eyes. "No one wins against the crucible," she finally said. "But if you impress us, perhaps we will show mercy to your kind." The guards cut the bindings from Marcus's wrists and shoved him forward into the center of the arena, where the crystal floor was stained with colors he did not want to think about. Colors that might have been blood from 100 different species. "You will fight the Crethanal," the queen announced, "a warrior bred for combat over 10,000 generations. And you will fight with nothing but what nature gave you. No weapons," Marcus realized, "and no armor. Just his bare hands against whatever nightmare they were about to unleash." A door opened on the far side of the arena, and something merged from the darkness that made Marcus's blood run cold. The Crethanal was massive, easily 8 feet tall and almost as wide, with scales the color of dried blood covering its entire body, and arms that ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel, and a face that was all teeth and rage and hunger. It saw Marcus and roared, a sound so loud and deep that Marcus felt it in his bones. And then it began to walk toward him with the slow confidence of a predator that had never known defeat. Marcus looked at his hands, at his small human body, at the monster approaching him, and he thought about his crew who had died in the void. And he thought about Earth and the 8 billion people who would burn if he failed here today. He remembered his childhood in New Detroit, where the streets were hard and the winters were harder, where he had learned to fight before he learned to read, where he had earned every single thing he ever had with blood and sweat and broken bones. He remembered the boxing ring at the military academy, where he had faced opponents bigger and stronger and meaner than him. And he had beaten them all because he simply refused to lose. He looked up at the queen on her throne of bones, and he looked at the thousands of soldiers watching from the walls, and he felt something rise up inside him. Something old and fierce, and human fear was there. Yes, but underneath the fear was something else. Something that burned like fire in his chest. The Crethanal was close now. Close enough that Marcus could smell it. A rank animal smell mixed with something like copper. And its claws gleamed in the crystal light. Marcus raised his fists and set his feet and took a deep breath. "Come on then," he said quietly, more to himself than to the monster. "Let me show you what a human can do." The Krethmal charged, and Marcus moved to meet it. And somewhere in the silent arena, 10,000 alien soldiers leaned forward to watch. What they were certain would be a very short fight, they were wrong.